Jason Okoye had everything. Power, wealth, and a name that commanded respect in Lagos. But love? That was a different game. He had found it in Amira Hassan, the only woman who saw him beyond his fortune, beyond his reputation. She had fought for him when no one else had. She had stayed when others had walked away. And now, she was his. Amira Hassan had changed everything. She wasn't impressed by his money or status. She had challenged him, stood by him, and refused to see him as anything but a man. She had fought for him when others had walked away. And now, she was his. But Jason had never learned how to love without control. Tonight, Amira sat curled up on his couch, wearing one of his shirts, her bare legs tucked beneath her. A soft glow from the city lights framed her figure. She looked comfortable, happy, and perfect. But the moment her phone rang, Jason's body tensed. She glanced at the screen before answering. "Hey, good to hear from you." "No, it's fine. Now's a good time." Jason's jaw clenched. A man's voice on the other end. Low, familiar. Amira was smiling, listening, nodding. Jason's grip tightened around the glass in his hand. He kept his expression blank, but his chest burned. "Work call," Amira said when she finally hung up. "I'll just be a sec." Jason didn't move. "Who was that?" She frowned. "Jason, it's just a client." "That's not what I asked," she sighed, setting her phone down. "Does it matter?" Something dark stirred in Jason's chest. "Yes, it does." Amira held his gaze, her expression calm but firm. "You need to trust me." Jason leaned forward, elbows resting, on his knees. His voice was quiet but sharp. "I do, but I don't trust them." Her lips pressed together. "Jason, we've talked about this. You don't own me." The words hit him harder than they should have. "I just don't want to lose you," he admitted. His voice was low, rough, almost vulnerable. Amira softened. "You won't." She reached for his hand. "But if you don't let me breathe, Jason, you'll push me away." Jason looked at their intertwined fingers. His world revolved around control. But with Amira, he was afraid of losing the one thing he couldn't replace. That night, Jason lay awake, watching Amira as she slept. He made a silent decision. He was never letting her go. Jason woke up before dawn, his mind clouded with thoughts of the night before. Amira lay beside him, breathing softly, her body curled into his. She looked peaceful, unaware of the storm, raging inside him. He reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek. She stirred slightly but didn't wake. For a moment he allowed himself to admire her, his woman, his love, his weakness. But weakness wasn't something Jason Okoye tolerated. Slipping out of bed, he grabbed his phone and scrolled through his contacts. He found the number he was looking for and sent a message. Cancel Amira's contract with that client, effective immediately. By the time Amira woke up, Jason was already dressed, standing near the window with a cup of coffee in hand. She stretched, lazily, and smiled. "Morning," she murmured, her voice still thick with sleep. Jason turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Morning." She sat up, running a hand through her hair. "I have a meeting later today. I'll be back by dinner." Jason set his cup down. "No, you won't," she blinked. "What do you mean?" Jason walked over, sitting on the edge of the bed. "I took care of it. You won't be working with that client anymore." Amira's smile faded. "Jason, what did you do?" He reached for her hand, his grip firm but gentle. "I'm protecting you, Amira. You don't need to be around men who don't respect boundaries." She pulled her hand away, a flicker of frustration in her eyes. "Jason, that was my contract, my work." "You don't need it," he said simply. Amira exhaled sharply. "That wasn't your decision to make." Jason's jaw tightened. "I won't apologize for keeping you safe." Her eyes searched for his frustration, mixing with something else, concern. "Jason, this isn't about safety," she said carefully. "This is about control." Jason's stomach twisted. He didn't like how that sounded. Didn't like how she was looking at him, as if he was the problem. "You're overreacting," he said, his voice colder than he intended. Amira got out of bed and walked past him, grabbing her phone. A few taps later, she let out a sharp breath. "You actually did it," she whispered, shaking her head. Jason stepped forward. "Amira, listen." "No," she cut him off. "This is not how this works." She turned to him, her expression hard. "You don't get to decide for me, Jason. If you can't see that we have a bigger problem, then I thought." Jason stood still as she walked away, his hands clenched into fists. She didn't understand. She belonged to him, and he wasn't letting her go. Amira didn't come home that night. Jason waited. Hours passed. His patience thinned with every tick of the clock. He had called her. No answer. Sent messages. No reply. By midnight, he was pacing. His thoughts twisted into dark possibilities. What if she was with someone else? What if she was lying? What if she was slipping away? His mind couldn't take it. He grabbed his keys and walked out. The city was alive even at night, but Jason felt nothing except the pulse of rage in his veins. He hated feeling powerless, hated that she could just walk away. He drove straight to her apartment. Lights were on. He exhaled sharply and knocked. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time. The door finally opened, and Amira stood there, her arms crossed. She looked calm, but Jason could see the exhaustion in her eyes. "You shouldn't be here," she said quietly. Jason pushed past her, stepping inside. "You shouldn't have left." She sighed, shutting the door. "I needed space, Jason." He turned, his gaze sharp. "Space from me?" Amira met his eyes, unshaken. "Yes." His chest tightened. "So you punish me by disappearing?" Amira shook her head. "This isn't punishment, Jason. It's a boundary. You crossed a line." Jason hated those words. He wasn't the villain here. He had done what was right. "I did what any man would do for the woman he loves." His voice was controlled, but his fists clenched. Amira stepped closer. "No! You did what a man does when he's afraid of losing control." Jason's pulse pounded. "I'm not afraid." She tilted her head, studying him. "Then why are you here? Why do you look like you haven't slept? Why did you come storming in like I belong to you?" His jaw tightened. "Because you do." Silence. Amira inhaled slowly. "No, Jason, I don't. I love you, but I am not something you own." The words cut deeper than she knew. Jason stepped back, his mind battling against the truth she had laid before him. She reached for him, but he pulled away. His heart was pounding. He needed her, but she was slipping through his fingers. Jason turned away, gripping the doorknob. His voice was low. "You say you love me, Amira, but love shouldn't hurt like this." He walked out, leaving the door open behind him. Jason didn't sleep that night. He sat in his penthouse, a glass of whiskey untouched beside him, staring at the city lights. Amira's words haunted him. "I love you, but I am not something you own." His fingers curled into fists. She was wrong. Love wasn't about ownership. It was about protection. She didn't understand. By morning, Jason had made a decision. If fear was the problem, he would erase it. If control was the issue, he would give her certainty. He would marry her. A ring, a commitment, a promise so binding that she would never walk away again. By noon, he had the most expensive engagement ring Lagos could offer. By sunset, he had planned a private getaway. When Amira opened her door, that evening Jason was waiting. She didn't invite him in, but he didn't need an invitation. "We're leaving tomorrow," he said. She frowned. "Leaving where?" "Somewhere quiet, just you and me." His voice was smooth, careful. Amira crossed her arms. "Jason, we need to talk. You can't just—" "This is the talk," he interrupted. "Come with me." She hesitated, searching his face. Jason knew what she was looking for, reassurance, but that wasn't what he was offering. She sighed. "Jason, say yes, Amira." His voice softened. "Trust me." She studied him for a long moment before finally nodding. The next evening, they were on a private island, a villa surrounded by the ocean. No distractions, no interruptions. Jason watched Amira as she walked barefoot along the shore, her dress swaying in the breeze. She was beautiful, too beautiful to lose. That night, over candlelight and wine, Jason pulled out the ring. "Marry me," he said, no hesitation, no doubt. Amira's breath caught. Her fingers trembled as she stared at the ring. "Jason," she whispered, her voice uncertain. Something inside him snapped. She should have said yes instantly. She should have smiled, kissed him, told him she was his forever. But she hesitated. Jason forced a smile. "What's wrong?" Amira swallowed. I need time." His chest tightened. "Time for what?" Her voice was gentle but firm. "To know if this is about love or fear." Jason's grip on the ring box tightened. She didn't trust him, and that realization felt like betrayal. Jason didn't say a word after Amira's hesitation. He simply closed the ring box and set it aside. The candlelight flickered between them, casting shadows across her face. He could see the uncertainty in her eyes, and it ate him alive. They were supposed to be past this. She was supposed to belong to him. Jason forced himself to smile. "Take your time, Amira," he said, his voice calm. "But not too much." She nodded slowly, but Jason could see the conflict in her. She loved him, he knew that, but why wasn't love enough? That night, he lay awake beside her, staring at the ceiling. She was so close, yet he felt like he was losing her. And Jason Okoye did not lose. By morning, Amira woke up to an empty bed. Jason had left early, taking a boat back to the city. Her calls went unanswered. For 3 days, Jason buried himself in work. He signed contracts without reading them. He made million-dollar deals he didn't care about. He ignored Amira's texts. If she wanted space, she could have all of it. But it didn't help. Nothing did. His mind was drowning in thoughts of her. On the 4th night, he finally picked up when she called. "Jason," Amira's voice was quiet, careful. "Where are you?" "At work," he lied. In reality, he was sitting alone in his penthouse, staring at the untouched engagement ring. "Are you okay?" she asked. Jason let out a bitter laugh. "I should be asking you that, since you're the one who needs time." She sighed. "Jason, please don't do this." "Do what?" His voice was sharper than he intended. "Give you space, respect your choices." Amira was silent for a moment. Then, softly, she said, "I love you, but I can't be in a relationship built on fear." Jason's fingers tightened around the glass in his hand. "I'm not afraid." "Then why are you running from me?" His jaw clenched. "I'm not running." "Then why won't you face me?" Jason exhaled through his nose. "Because I don't want to hear you say no." Amira's voice didn't waver. "I haven't said no, Jason, but I won't say yes until I know you love me enough to let me go." Jason's pulse pounded. She didn't get it. Letting go wasn't an option. He ended the call without another word. Jason didn't sleep after hanging up on Amira. Her words echoed in his mind. "I won't say yes until I know you love me enough to let me go." Let her go? Never. By the time dawn broke, Jason had made up his mind. If she needed proof of his love, he would give it to her, on his terms. That evening, he sent his driver to pick her up. Amira hesitated but eventually got into the car. When she arrived at his penthouse, the air was thick with tension. Jason stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a drink in his hand, watching the city. He didn't turn when she entered. "I didn't think you'd come," he said after a long silence. Amira stepped forward. We needed to talk. Jason finally faced her. His eyes were dark, unreadable. Then talk. Amira exhaled. Jason, I love you, but love isn't control. It isn't fear, and it's not possession. Jason clenched his jaw. You think I want to own you? She held his gaze. Don't you? His fingers tightened around his glass. I want to protect you. From what? Her voice softened. The world, or yourself. Jason set his drink down and stepped toward her. Do you know what it's like to have something so precious, so necessary, and feel it slipping through your fingers? Amira didn't move. Jason, I'm not slipping away, but you keep trying to hold me so tight that I can't breathe. Jason's chest tightened. She didn't understand. You're all I have, Amira. His voice was raw, low. I can't lose you. Amira reached for his hand, but he pulled back. You won't, she whispered. But Jason, you have to trust me. Let me choose you, not be forced into staying. Jason's hands curled into fists. I don't know how, she sighed. Then that's what we need to fix. Jason let out a bitter laugh. What if I can't be fixed? Amira stepped closer, pressing a hand to his chest. You're not broken, Jason, but you have to let go of the fear. Jason looked into her eyes, the warmth in them cutting through his anger. He swallowed hard. I don't know how to stop. Amira held him tighter. Then let me teach you. Jason stood in silence. Amira's hand pressed against his chest. Her warmth should have soothed him, but it only made the ache worse. She wanted him to let go, but letting go meant losing control. His entire life had been built on power, dominance, and certainty. He wasn't weak. He wasn't the kind of man who begged. But with Amira, he felt like a man drowning in his own fears. He stepped back, breaking her touch. Jason, Amira whispered. He shook his head. I can't do this right now. Pain flashed in her eyes, but she nodded. Then I'll go. Jason didn't stop her this time. He watched as she picked up her bag, gave him one last lingering look, and walked out of his penthouse. The moment the door shut, something inside Jason snapped. He grabbed the whiskey bottle from the table and poured himself a drink. Then another, then another. The burn in his throat was nothing compared to the one in his chest. For the next week, Jason threw himself into work, drowning in deals and contracts, pretending Amira's absence didn't gut him. He ignored her calls, deleted her messages without reading them. He convinced himself it was for the best, but power couldn't fill the emptiness inside him. One night, he found himself in a bar, whiskey in hand, surrounded by people who admired him, feared him, wanted to be him. A woman slid into the seat beside him, all soft smiles and sultry eyes. She traced a manicured finger over the rim of his glass. I hear you're single now, she purred. Jason's grip tightened around the drink. His jaw clenched. For a moment he thought about it. Thought about letting himself forget, thought about losing himself in someone else. But as he turned to face her, all he saw was Amira. Her eyes, her voice, the way she had looked at him the night she walked away. Jason pushed his drink aside and stood up without a word. The woman called after him, but he didn't care. Outside, the night air was thick with heat and regret. His heart pounded, his body ached. He had everything, but without Amira it felt like he had nothing. And for the first time in his life, Jason Okoye knew what it meant to fall. Jason sat alone in his penthouse, surrounded by silence. The whiskey bottle on the table was half empty, but he felt no warmth from it. Nothing filled the emptiness Amira had left behind. He had spent the past week convincing himself that she would come back, that she just needed time. But time was cruel. Every day without her felt like a lifetime. When his phone buzzed, his heart jumped. Amira. For a long moment he just stared at the screen. His fingers hovered over the answer button, but pride, stubbornness, and fear held him back. Another buzz, a message. "Jason, we need to talk, please." Jason exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. He had two choices, open the door or shut her out forever. By the time he made his decision, he was already grabbing his keys. The drive to Amira's apartment was a blur. Jason barely remembered. Parking before he was knocking at her door. It opened slowly, and there she stood. Amira looked at him, her expression unreadable. He hated that he couldn't tell what she was thinking. Had she moved on? Had she decided he wasn't worth the fight anymore? His stomach twisted. He stepped inside, the tension between them thick, suffocating. Amira crossed her arms. "You ignored me for a week." Jason's jaw tightened. "You left. I needed space." "I needed you," Jason admitted, his voice rough. She studied him, her gaze searching. "Jason, I love you. But love can't be about fear and control." Jason clenched his fists. "I wasn't trying to control you." Amira stepped closer. "Then why did you take away my choices, my contracts? Why do you shut me out every time I ask you to trust me?" Jason swallowed hard. "Because if I let you go, you might never come back," she softened. "Jason, love is about choosing each other every day, not about being trapped." He let out a bitter laugh. "And what if you choose to leave?" Amira's hand touched his chest, right over his heart. "Then you have to trust me enough to believe I won't." Jason looked into her eyes. His entire life, he had been afraid of losing, afraid of being left behind, afraid of not being enough. But Amira was still standing here, still fighting for him. And maybe he needed to start fighting for himself too. Jason's heart pounded beneath Amira's touch. Her words lingered in the air, heavy with truth. "Then you have to trust me enough to believe I won't." Trust. Jason had built his empire on power, on control, on never needing to trust anyone. But Amira, she had never been something he could own. She was a woman of her own making, strong, fearless, and willing to walk away if he pushed too hard. His throat tightened. "What if I don't know how to trust?" Amira sighed, stepping back. The distance between them felt unbearable. "Then this will never work." Jason's hands curled into fists. His chest burned with the familiar feeling of losing control. "I can try," he said, his voice lower, rougher. Amira studied him, uncertain. "Jason, I don't need you to try for me. I need you to try for yourself." He ran a hand through his hair. "I don't know how to stop wanting to protect you, to keep you close, to make sure no one takes you away from me." She shook her head. "Love isn't about keeping me locked inside your world. It's about being strong enough to let me walk beside you." Her words cut deep. Jason exhaled, stepping closer. "I don't want to lose you, Amira." "Then prove it." Her voice was soft but firm. "Not with control, not with power. Prove it by letting go of the fear." Jason hesitated. Could he do that? Could he let her move freely, make her own choices, and trust that she would always return to him? His entire life he had been chasing certainty, but love was never certain. Amira reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "Let's start over, from the beginning." Jason looked down at their hands, at the woman who had done something no one else had. Stayed. A slow breath left his lips. "And if I fail?" Her lips curved into the softest smile. "Then we try again." Jason swallowed hard. His entire life had been about control, but maybe, just this once, he could surrender to love. He squeezed her hand. "Okay." Amira's eyes softened. "Okay." Jason pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. This time, he wasn't holding on too tight. He was simply holding her. 1 month later, Jason sat in the dimly lit therapy office, his hands clasped together. Across from him, the therapist, a man who had seen power in many forms, watched him carefully. "You've built an empire, Mr. Okoye," the therapist said, "but love is not a business. You can't control its outcome." Jason inhaled deeply. He had fought wars in the boardroom, commanded respect with just a glance, but sitting here, he felt more vulnerable than he ever had. "I don't want to control it anymore," Jason admitted. "I just want to be better." The therapist nodded. "That's a start." Jason exhaled, his mind drifting to Amira. She had asked for proof, and this was it. Not an expensive ring, not a locked door, not a claim over her life, but a man who was willing to face his demons for her. 2 months later, Jason stood in the middle of Amira's apartment, watching as she packed a suitcase. She turned to him with a small smirk. "You're sure you're ready for this?" Jason chuckled, shaking his head. "I should be asking you that." They were leaving Lagos for a while, just the two of them. No distractions, no power struggles, just love in its rawest form. Amira zipped up the bag and crossed the room to him, looping her arms around his neck. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. Jason's arms wrapped around her waist. "I'm proud of us." Amira smiled, pulling him into a deep kiss. One that wasn't rushed, wasn't desperate. It was simply right. For the first time in his life, Jason Okoye understood that love wasn't about holding on too tightly. It was about trusting that she would always choose to stay, and this time she did. But just as they were ready to leave, Jason's phone rang. He glanced at the screen, expecting a business call, but the name flashing on the screen made his body go rigid. Amira noticed the change in his expression. "Who is it?" Jason swallowed hard, his grip on the phone tightening. "Someone I never expected to hear from again," he muttered, his voice unreadable. The phone kept ringing. Outside, the world was waiting. But inside, Jason knew some stories never truly end. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, comment what you learned from the tale, and subscribe for more enchanting African stories.